body-positive lady. Harry had been at Hogwarts for exactly 3 weeks, and they were beginning to think that perhaps the Dursley suburban hell wasn't actually the worst place on earth. At least Vernon's bigotry was straightforward and predictable. Here at Hogwarts, navigating the social minefield required a PhD in whatever the hell intersectional theory was, and Harry was pretty sure they were failing that class spectacularly. It had started innocently enough. During their second week, Harry had overheard a group of 7th-year girls talking about the portrait that guarded the entrance to Gryffindor Tower. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint with the newly formed Student Wellness Committee about body-shaming terminology being used to describe school fixtures. "It's just so problematic," one of the girls was saying as Harry passed by in the corridor. "Like, calling her the fat lady is literally violent against people who don't conform to conventional beauty standards." "Totally," agreed another. "I mean, she's a person too, even if she's just a painting. She probably has feelings about being reduced to her body size." Harry had paused, genuinely confused. But she's a painting of someone who's been dead for like 400 years. The girls had turned to stare at Harry with the kind of horrified expression usually reserved for people who kicked puppies or supported the Tories. "That's incredibly insensitive," the first girl had said. "Dead people deserve respect too. And just because she's a painting doesn't mean she doesn't have agency." Agency? Harry had repeated, feeling like they were missing something fundamental about how portraits worked. The right to define herself on her own terms, the second girl explained with the patience of someone talking to a particularly slow child. Instead of being labelled by her physical appearance. Harry had walked away from that conversation feeling like they'd accidentally stepped into some sort of alternate reality where basic logic had been suspended. But that was before they learned about the committee's official recommendation. The Student Wellness Committee, it turned out, was a new institution created by Dumbledore in response to what he called the evolving needs of our diverse student body. It was comprised of 12 students from different houses, backgrounds, and lived experiences, and it met twice weekly to discuss issues of inclusion, representation, and emotional safeties within the school. Harry had learned all this from Hermione, who had naturally been elected as the committee secretary within its first week of existence. She'd been absolutely glowing with purpose when she'd explained the committee's first major initiative over breakfast. "We're going to transform the way students interact with the school's portrait community," she'd announced, unrolling what appeared to be a scroll containing several pages of densely written text. "Starting with the discriminatory naming conventions that have been perpetuated for centuries." "What discriminatory naming conventions?" Harry had asked, though they were beginning to suspect they didn't want to know. "Well, for starters, referring to the Gryffindor Tower Guardian as of the Fat Lady is obviously problematic. It reduces her entire identity to a single physical characteristic, which is both dehumanizing and reinforces harmful beauty standards." Ramad had looked up from his halal breakfast sausages with interest. "So what are you going to call her instead?" The committee voted unanimously to use body-positive ladies as a transitional term while we work with her to determine what she preferred to be called. Harry had nearly choked on their pumpkin juice. "You're going to ask a painting what it wants to be called?" "She's not a nit, Harry. She's a person with agency and dignity. She's literally oil on canvas. That's incredibly reductive. Magical portraits contain the essence and personality of the original person. They deserve the same respect would give to any member of our community." At this point, Snape had wandered over from the high table, presumably drawn by the sound of someone saying something stupid. "You're really about to rename the Fat Lady?" he'd asked, shaking his head. "There's some next-level nonsense right here." "Professor Snape," Hermione had said stiffly, "the committee's recommendations are based on extensive research into best practices for inclusive language." Best practices according to who? Some dusty-ass textbook written by people who ain't never had a real job? According to leading experts in social justice and educational equity. Snape had laughed, a sound like broken glass. Social justice? Baby girl, that painting been hanging in the same spot for 300 years singing opera and drinking wine. She don't give a damn what you'll call her as long as you remember the password. That's exactly the kind of dismissive attitude that perpetuates systemic oppression, Hermione had replied, her voice rising. Systemic oppression? Of a painting? Girl, you need to get out more. Harry had watched this exchange with growing fascination. There was something almost beautiful about the way Hermione's commitment to social justice collided with Snape's complete refusal to engage with political correctness. It was like watching an unstoppable force meet an immovable object, if the unstoppable force was powered by righteous indignation and the immovable object was powered by not giving a single fuck. But the real entertainment had started 3 days later, when the committee's recommendations were officially implemented. Harry had been returning to Gryffindor Tower after a particularly exhausting defense against the dark arts class. Professor Quirrell had spent the entire period stammering through a lecture about the problematic colonial implications of certain defensive spells when they'd encountered the first group of students trying to navigate the new system. "Excuse me, body-positive lady," a nervous-looking second year was saying to the portrait, "could you please open the passage to Gryffindor Tower?" The painting, who had been introduced to Harry 3 weeks ago as simply the fat lady, looked down at the student with obvious confusion. "I'm sorry, dear, but I don't know what you're talking about. Are you looking for someone?" "We're looking for you," the second year replied. "We need to get into Gryffindor Tower." "Well, of course you are, sweetie. But I'm the fat lady. I don't know anyone called body-positive lady." A third year stepped forward, looking embarrassed. "The school administration has decided that your previous name was inappropriate. So now we're supposed to call you body-positive lady." The fat lady's expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been amusement. "Oh, how delightfully modern. And who exactly decided that my name was inappropriate?" "The Student Wellness Committee." "I see. And did anyone think to ask me what I thought about this change?" The students exchanged glances. "Well, no. But the committee did extensive research on inclusive language practices." "How thoughtful of them. And what happens if I choose not to respond to this new name?" I don't know." The fat lady smiled, and Harry couldn't help but notice it wasn't a particularly nice smile. "Well, this should be interesting. What's the password, dears?" "Caput Draconis," the third year replied quickly. "I'm sorry, but I don't hear anyone I recognize asking for entry. Perhaps you should try addressing me properly." The students looked at each other in panic. But we called you body-positive lady." "Indeed you did. But I'm the fat lady, and I've been the fat lady for 3 centuries. I'm not particularly interested in changing my identity to accommodate the political sensibilities of 12-year-olds. But the committee said, "The committee can say whatever it likes. I'll be here when they've all graduated and moved on to find new things to be offended about." Harry had watched this standoff with growing amusement. Leave it to Hogwarts to find a way to make entering your own dormitory a political statement. Excuse me," Harry had said, stepping forward. "Fat lady, could you please let us in? The password is Caput Draconis." The portrait had swung open immediately. "Of course, dear. Welcome home." As the students filed through the passage, Harry could hear the second year muttering, "But that's not inclusive language." "Tough shit," Harry had muttered back, and immediately felt guilty for being so blunt. But honestly, at what point did accommodation become absurdity? The situation had only gotten worse over the following days. The Student Wellness Committee had apparently anticipated resistance from the portrait because they'd implemented what Hermione called a comprehensive education and engagement strategy. This turned out to mean that every morning, a rotating group of committee members would visit the fat lady's portrait to conduct what they called affirmation sessions. Harry had witnessed the first one entirely by accident. They'd been returning from an early morning run, a habit picked up during their time with the Dursleys, when exercise was the only acceptable way to leave the house, when they'd encountered Hermione standing in front of the portrait with a clipboard and what appeared to be a prepared speech. "Good morning, body-positive lady," Hermione had said brightly. "I'm here for today's affirmation session." The fat lady had looked down at her with the expression of someone who had reached the absolute limit of their patience. "Young lady, I have told you repeatedly that I am the fat lady." I have been the fat lady since 1672. I will continue to be the fat lady until someone paints over me or burns down the castle. I understand that change can be difficult, Hermione had replied, consulting her clipboard. That's why we're implementing a gradual transition process. Today's affirmation is about embracing body positivity and rejecting harmful societal beauty standards. I beg your pardon. The committee has prepared a series of daily affirmations designed to help you internalize more positive self-image concepts. Would you like to begin? The fat lady had stared at Hermione for a long moment. Are you suggesting that I have a negative self-image? Well, not exactly, but the language you use to describe yourself does reflect internalized fat phobia and satphobia. The fat lady's voice had risen to a pitch that made several nearby portraits cover their ears. I'm a 300-year-old painting of a woman who enjoyed food, wine, and life. I am fat and I am proud of it. I have never, in 3 centuries, met anyone more comfortable with their body than I am. But using the word fat as a descriptor perpetuates negative stereotypes about. The only negative stereotype I see here is the one that suggests I need a teenage girl to teach me how to feel about my own body. Harry had backed away slowly, recognizing the signs of an impending explosion. They'd seen that same look on Aunt Petunia's face right before she'd thrown Vernon's breakfast at the wall. The committee's research indicates that positive affirmations can help individuals overcome internalized bias. Get out, the fat lady had screamed, her voice echoing through the corridor. Get out and take your patronizing nonsense with you. Several other portraits had started shouting in support. Sir Cadogan had drawn his sword and was waving it enthusiastically. The knight in the 3rd-floor corridor had started singing what sounded like a medieval battle hymn. Hermione had stood her ground, clutching her clipboard like a shield. I understand you're experiencing some resistance to change, but if we could just work through today's affirmation exercise. I'll show you resistance to change, the fat lady had shrieked, and suddenly wine had started pouring from her portrait like a waterfall, drenching Hermione from head to toe. This is assault. Hermione had sputtered, dripping with what smelled like very expensive burgundy. This is communication, the fat lady had roared back. I am communicating, in the clearest possible terms, that I want you to leave me alone. Harry had helped Hermione back to the common room, where she'd spend the next hour writing what she called an incident report for the Student Wellness Committee. The report, which Harry had glimpsed over her shoulder, was 6 pages long and included phrases like violent resistance to inclusive language practices and internalized oppression manifesting as aggressive behavior. Maybe, Harry had suggested carefully, the fat lady just likes being called the fat lady. That's exactly the problem, Harry. She's been conditioned by centuries of patriarchal beauty standards to accept derogatory language about her body. But what if she actually doesn't think fat is derogatory? Then she's suffering from false consciousness. False consciousness? When people from marginalized groups internalize oppressive ideologies and believe they're acting freely when they're actually reinforcing their own oppression. Harry had stared at Hermione, trying to process this logic. So, if she says she likes being called the fat lady, she's wrong about her own feelings. She's been programmed by societal conditioning to accept harmful language. But if she says she doesn't like being called body-positive lady, that's also wrong. That's resistance to positive change. So basically, whatever she says, she's wrong. Hermione had looked uncomfortable. It's more complex than that, Harry. Is it thou? But the Student Wellness Committee had been undeterred by the wine incident. If anything, they seemed to interpret the fat lady's resistance as proof that their intervention was necessary. The affirmation sessions had continued, despite the portrait's increasingly creative methods of expressing her displeasure. By the end of the week, students attempting to enter Gryffindor Tower had to navigate not only the password system but also whatever chaos the fat lady had decided to unleash in response to that morning's affirmation session. Monday had been wine. Tuesday had been opera sung at volumes that shattered windows 3 floors away. Wednesday had been a dramatic recitation of every curse word she'd learned in 3 centuries, delivered in 5 different languages. Thursday had been her refusing to acknowledge anyone who didn't address her as her magnificent fatness, queen of the abundant and destroyer of dietary restrictions. Friday had been the worst yet. Harry had approached the portrait that evening to find a crowd of students gathered outside, all looking deeply uncomfortable. The fat lady was engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument with a nervous-looking fourth year who was holding the committee's daily affirmation script. "I don't understand why you're being so resistant to this process," the fourth year was saying. "We're trying to help you develop a more positive relationship with your body." "A more positive relationship with my body," the fat lady had repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "Child, I have been inhabiting this body for 300 years. I have sung arias that made grown men weep. I have consumed wine that cost more than your family's annual income. I have flirted with kings and told jokes that scandalized courts across Europe. I have lived more fully in this painted form than most people manage in their entire flesh and blood existences. And you think I need help developing a positive relationship with my body? The committee's research shows that positive affirmations can help overcome internalized negative self-perception. My self-perception is magnificent. I'm a glorious, abundant, fabulous woman who has never met a pleasure I didn't embrace or a song I couldn't sing better than anyone else. The only negative thing in my existence is having to listen to teenagers tell me how I should feel about myself." The fourth year had consulted the script desperately. "But wouldn't you feel better if people used more inclusive language when referring to you? I would feel better if people minded their own bloody business. The committee feels that creating a more welcoming environment for all body types requires. The committee can feel whatever it likes. I require nothing from you except the password and the basic courtesy of being addressed by my chosen name. But fat lady isn't inclusive of. It's my name." At this point, Professor McGonagall had appeared, looking like she'd rather be doing literally anything else. "What exactly is going on here?" she'd asked, surveying the crowd of students and the clearly agitated portrait. "The body-positive lady is being resistant to the committee's inclusion initiatives," the fourth year had explained. "I am the fat lady," the portrait had screamed. "I have been the fat lady for 3 centuries. I will die the fat lady." McGonagall had pinched the bridge of her nose. "Miss Thompson, perhaps you could explain to me why you're attempting to rename a centuries-old portrait. The Student Wellness Committee determined that the current naming convention perpetuates harmful beauty standards and creates an unwelcoming environment for students who don't conform to conventional body ideals." "I see. And did anyone consult the portrait about this decision?" "We've been conducting daily affirmation sessions to help her overcome internalized bias." "She doesn't have internalized bias." Harry had burst out, unable to stay quiet any longer. "She's been telling you for a week that she likes her name." "Harry, you don't understand the complexities of internalized oppression," Hermione had said, appearing at Harry's elbow with her ever-present clipboard. "I understand that you are driving everyone mental with this nonsense." Harry had sought back. "It's not nonsense, it's social justice. It's harassment. It's education. It's bloody stupid is what it is." Professor McGonagall had held up a hand for silence. "Perhaps we could ask the portrait herself what she prefers to be called." "We've been trying to do that," the fourth year had said. "But she's been resistant to embracing more positive self-image concepts. Have you considered that she might actually prefer her current name? That would be internalized fat phobia." McGonagall had turned to the portrait. "Fat lady, what would you like to be called?" "I would like to be called the fat lady, as I have been for 300 years, and I would like these children to stop trying to fix problems that don't exist." "There, you see," McGonagall had said. "Problem solved." "But Professor," Hermione had protested, "we can't just ignore the harmful implications of body-shaming language." "Miss Granger, the only person being harmed here is the portrait, who is being subjected to daily harassment by well-meaning students who refuse to listen to her clearly expressed preferences. It's not harassment, it's inclusive education." "It's harassment," McGonagall had said firmly. "And it stops now." "But the committee's research." "The committee's research can be used to write a very nice essay for extra credit in Transfiguration. It will not be used to torment portraits who have explicitly requested to be left alone." Harry had watched Hermione's face go through several expressions: confusion, indignation, hurt, and finally a kind of desperate righteousness. Professor McGonagall, with respect, this attitude is exactly what perpetuates systemic oppression. When marginalized voices speak out against harmful language, they're dismissed as being difficult or unreasonable. The fat lady's resistance to change is a perfect example of how internalized bias prevents people from recognizing their own oppression. Miss Granger, McGonagall had said, her voice taking on the dangerously quiet tone that every student learned to fear, "Are you suggesting that I don't understand oppression?" "I'm suggesting that even well-meaning people can perpetuate harmful systems without realizing it." "I see. And you believe that you, at 16 years old, understand the complexities of oppression better than a portrait who has been observing human behavior for 3 centuries, or a professor who has been teaching for longer than you've been alive. I believe that education and awareness are ongoing processes for everyone. Indeed they are. Which is why you're about to learn something very important about the difference between activism and arrogance." Harry had winced. They'd seen McGonagall in this mood before, usually right before someone got detention for the rest of the term. The fat lady has clearly and repeatedly expressed her preference for how she wishes to be addressed. She has explained that she finds your attempts to rename her patronizing and offensive. She has asked you to stop. Your response has been to ignore her stated preferences and continue forcing your agenda on her against her will. Tell me, Miss Granger, how exactly does that represent respecting marginalized voices? Hermione had opened her mouth, then closed it again. The fat lady is not internalized anything. She is a confident, self-assured woman who knows her own mind and has chosen her own identity. Your inability to accept her choice reveals far more about your own biases than it does about hers. But the language she has chosen for herself, which is her right, not yours. Harry had watched this exchange with growing respect for McGonagall and growing concern for Hermione, who looked like she was about to cry. Furthermore, McGonagall had continued, your assumption that anyone who disagrees with your methods must be suffering from false consciousness is exactly the kind of intellectual arrogance that gives activism a bad name. You're not liberating anyone. You're imposing your worldview on others and calling it justice. And trying to create a more inclusive environment. You're trying to force everyone to conform to your definition of inclusion, which is neither inclusive nor respectful. True inclusion means listening to people and respecting their choices, even when those choices don't align with your preferred terminology. The fat lady had started applauding. Signally. Someone with sense. The daily affirmation sessions will stop immediately, McGonagall had announced. The portrait will be addressed by her chosen name. And the Student Wellness Committee will focus on actual student welfare rather than harassing school fixtures. The professor. The matter is closed, Miss Granger. Now, I believe you all have homework to complete. As the crowd had dispersed, Harry had lingered, watching Hermione stare at the fat lady with a mixture of hurt and confusion. I don't understand, she'd said quietly to Harry. I was trying to help. I know you were, Harry had replied. But maybe help looks different than you thought it would. She's internalized so much harmful messaging about her body. Or maybe she just likes being called the fat lady. But how can she like something that's objectively harmful? Harry had looked at their friend, brilliant and passionate and absolutely convinced that she was right about everything, and felt a wave of something that might have been pity. Maybe it's not objectively harmful, Hermione. Maybe it's just different from what you would choose. But the research is about other people. Know her. Hermione had stood there for a long moment, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. I just wanted to make things better. I know. But sometimes making things better means leaving them alone. As they'd headed up to the dormitory, Harry had turned back to see the fat lady settling into her frame with obvious relief. Good night, fat lady, Harry had called. Good night, dear. Sweet dreams. It had been the most normal interaction Harry had had at Hogwarts in weeks.